On this channel, I've basically been talking about Crash 4 non-stop since it's released, and there's a reason for that. It's an amazing game. But now that I've gotten to know it pretty well, I think it's a good time to start thinking about the next step for the series, at least in the context of main games. So, in this video, I'll be talking about the ideas that I have and things I'd like to see in a potential Crash Bandicoot 5. Before I do though, I just quickly want to mention that this video idea was suggested to me by a viewer named DarkMinister13. Cheers for the suggestion, and I'm more than willing to take any suggestions from viewers into consideration. And speaking of viewers, I actually found out that only 3% of viewers on my channel are actually subscribed, so hit that big red button if you haven't already, and leave a like on the video if you enjoyed. Anyway, Crash 5, let's crack on! I think it's fairly obvious how Crash 5 will most likely turn out gameplay-wise, so I wanted to start by focusing on the characters and plot that I think should appear. DarkMinister13 was particularly interested to hear what I thought about Crash 5 reintroducing Crash Bandicoot and Nina Cortex into this new timeline, and I definitely think that's what the game should do, but I don't think it should stop there. There are so many fantastic characters that were introduced post Naughty Dog, and I think Crash 5 is the perfect opportunity to do that, but rather than list a bunch of characters and say why I want them to return, I think I should go over my idea for the plot first. What I would like to see is a retelling of the Wrath of Cortex, but reimagined in such a way that it is more plot focused and includes a wider variety of characters. The main premise of the plot would still mostly be the same, but with some added elements and details. The game would begin with Cortex and Uka Uka escaping the end of the universe and enacting a new plan for world domination. Uka Uka releases the elementals and Cortex brings his newest creation, Crash Bandicoot, to life to use their powers. I figure Cortex and Uka Uka's goal would be something like using the elementals to destroy the world and recreate it in their image, or something ridiculous like that. Simple but effective stuff for a Crash game. Once Aku Aku catches on that something is wrong, he, Crash and Coco set out to stop Cortex and Uka Uka. One thing that never made sense to me is why the elementals are actually evil, so I figure that in this timeline the elementals should have more of a neutral alignment, but fall under the influence of Uka Uka's evil magic or something once they're released. That neutral alignment would make it possible for Crash and Coco to free the elementals from Uka Uka's influence and have them join forces, allowing Crash and Coco to restore the damage done and fight back against Crash, Cortex and Uka Uka. Another plot point in Wrath of Cortex that confused me is that in the final boss and true ending, Crash attacks Cortex and during the ending is randomly freed from Cortex's control and becomes a good guy, implying that he was somehow hypnotized. That was never really explained, but I think I have a solution. Entrance. This would be the perfect way of introducing Entrance to the mainline series of Crash games. It could be that Cortex was unable to discipline and maintain control of Crash, so he enlisted the help of Entrance to make that possible. Defeating Entrance in a boss fight would then explain how Crash would regain control of his own mind, and join Crash and Coco to confront Cortex together. How would Cortex meet Entrance, you ask? Well, Crash 4 was all about causing dimensional rifts and messing with the multiverse, so it wouldn't be far-fetched to say that Entrance was caught in a rift and ended up in our dimension with our Crash, Coco, Cortex and so on. Right, so we've got Crash, the elementals and Entrance sorted. But what about Nina? How could this plot concept make room for Nina Cortex? Well, I have an idea. Nina is a student at the Academy of Evil, so it would make sense for her inclusion to be something along the lines of her doing work experience or practical assignments or something. So she ends up working under her uncle to practice and gain experience being a villain, which would lead nicely into her being a playable character, but I'll get to that later. As for other potential villains and bosses like Tiny, Engine, Embryo, Pinstripe and maybe even Scorporilla, it wouldn't take much explaining or reasoning for their inclusion. They work for Cortex, and that's all there's ever been to it. I imagine they would also want to include the new version of Torna somehow, but I'm not 100% sure how they would actually do that in the context of this plot. But what I also want them to do is introduce brand new characters. Not more masks or alternate dimension versions of characters, I mean brand new characters. Anyway, that's my main idea for the plot. So how do I imagine such a story playing out in the context of a game? Well, the opening cutscene would be quite predictable. Picking up from the end of Crash 4, Cortex and Uka Uka escape the end of the universe and return to their dimension. Uka Uka would head to a temple where the elementals are sealed away. Aku Aku senses something is wrong, and he, Crash, and Coco head to said temple to figure out what's going on. This would be the first world of the game, and would end with Uka Uka deploying a low-ranking minion of Cortex's like Ripperoo or Koala Kong to distract the Bandicoots while he escapes with the elementals. After defeating this first boss, our heroes would pursue Uka Uka and end up in a location being ravaged by relentless earthquakes. This is where Crunch is introduced, and he is using the power of Rocco to cause this damage. Crash and Coco make their way to Crunch and Rocco and fight them, freeing Rocco from Uka Uka's influence while Crunch retreats. I imagine the third world would introduce Nina as the boss of the area. What the world would be exactly, I don't know, but that's probably a good time to introduce her. The fourth world though would be a location suffering the damage of tsunamis and floods at the hands of Crunch and Wawa, who are eventually defeated, resulting in freeing Wawa and Crunch retreating. You should be beginning to understand the pattern here. There will be a world with a regular boss, then a world with Crunch and an elemental as the boss, and that cycle will repeat until the 8th world, where Crunch and Lolo are the bosses. The 9th and 10th worlds would go to Entrance and Cortex respectively, which would make 10 worlds total, the same amount that Crash 4 has. After the 9th world, Crunch is free from being hypnotized and joins Crash and Coco to confront Cortex in the 10th world, who, like in Crash 4 with the Quantum Masks, will snatch the elementals and use them against our heroes in the final boss fight. It's a pretty short explanation, but that's how I imagine this concept playing out. Regardless of what Crash 5 actually turns out to be, I expect that it will maintain traditional Crash gameplay in the exact same way that Crash 4 did, so I won't go into too much detail about that. But there is a very good reason why I wanted to turn the elementals from outright villains into neutral characters or maybe even good guys, and that's to use them as power-ups in the same way as the Quantum Masks. I mean, it's a no-brainer and would easily work quite well. They would each have unique powers for Crash and Coco just like the Quantum Masks. Rocco could turn Crash and Coco into massive boulders just like Crunch did in the first boss of Wrath of Cortex, which would allow for some fun Atmosphere style level segments. Wawa could have a power that would allow Crash and Coco to walk on the surface of water, raise the level of the water and also dive into it to swim. I imagine that would lead to some tricky and challenging puzzles. Pyro could function in the same way as the Fruit Bazooka, in that he would allow Crash and Coco to launch a fiery projectile. Finally, Lolo could have a power that would create a sort of updraft to lift Crash and Coco into the air and allow them to glide over long distances. These are just my ideas on what powers they could have, but I think it definitely is possible to use the elementals as gameplay mechanics in the same way as the Quantum Masks. The other good thing about the concept is that Crunch would also be able to use those powers. Crunch would be a playable character in this theoretical Crash 5 in the same manner as the additional playable characters in Crash 4. He would play differently to Crash and Coco, most likely not being able to jump as high or slide, but would be a lot stronger. And since using the elementals was his whole gimmick in Wrath of Cortex, and also in my concept, it makes sense that he would also be able to use the elementals in the same way that Crash and Coco would. I also mentioned that I think Nina should also be a playable character, and since she has been a playable character before in Twinsanity, it would make sense for her to have those same abilities, or at least similar ones. Crunch and Nina would both take part in timeline levels, which are an amazing concept that I'd like to see brought back in Crash 5. Although I want them to be entirely separate levels, not half a level of an additional playable character and the rest is Crash and Coco. No, they need to be full levels with only the additional playable characters taking part. Crunch and Nina's timeline levels would see them attempt to sabotage and prevent Crash and Coco from progressing. Seeing as Crunch also becomes a good guy towards the end of this plot that I've come up with, he'd most likely have his own mandatory levels as well. Whether other playable characters would be in the game, such as Torna, Dingadal, Cortex, or even a brand new character, I'm not sure, but I'll be happy to see them only if they aren't forced and make sense within the context of the plot. If they would feel out of place or unnecessary, I'd rather not have the extra playable characters and keep the focus on Crunch and Nina. Anyway, now that I've got my own personal thoughts and ideas out of the way, I think we should talk about the things I expect to see and things I'd like carried over from Crash 4. Obviously, things like gems, colour gems, and time trials will return, and I'm in favour of that. They're staples of the series, so it wouldn't feel right to leave them behind. The mechanic of using gems to unlock skins is also something I'd welcome in a future entry. I really want to see the new art style for Crash 4 carry over into Crash 5, alongside the musical talents of Walter Mayer. Hopefully they'll also reach out to Josh Mansell so they can work together and produce an absolute masterpiece of a soundtrack. I fully expect the option for modern and retro mode to return, as well as the multiplayer modes Pass and Play and Bandicoot Battle. Things I'd like to see return in Crash 5 but might not actually do so are the inverted mode and flashback tapes. Seeing inverted mode come back is, I'd say, likelier than the flashback tapes, since all of Crash and Coco's flashback tapes have been shown. So the only way I can imagine them coming back is if flashback tapes for Crunch or maybe Torna were made for Crash 5. There are some things I think Crash 4 should leave behind though. The biggest thing is the insanely perfect relics. They can go to hell, since it's just unnecessary padding. I understand that there's supposed to be a nod to Crash 1's gem system, but Crash 1's gem system was rubbish, so I think we can do away with that. I also don't want to see that bloody checkpoint system in the boss fights, because they make them way too short and way too easy. And I think that just about wraps it up. Those were my ideas, expectations and hopes for a potential Crash Bandicoot 5. If you enjoyed, I encourage you to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, let me know in the comments section what you'd like to see in Crash 5. What direction do you think the series will head in? I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.